Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar with All Children Reading, a Grand Challenge for Development. My name is Deborah Backus, and I'm the All Children Reading Director at Project Director at World Vision. Sorry about that background feed. We are pleased to have you here and to share our experience in adapting the early grade reading assessment to include sign language. Before I get started, I just wanted to do a few items of housekeeping. Just as you joined, you'll notice that we were muting you and also closing most of your videos. We just want to make sure that the speaker's video and the ASL interpreter videos are front and center. So apologies for doing that, but it'll just make our process a little bit more streamlined. I also wanted to note that the video is being recorded and we'll share it with you afterwards with closed captioning. We'll also be sending out a survey after the webinar for those that are really interested in engaging more in what we're talking about today. If you have any questions or comments or issues with the sound or video, please feel free to just send through a chat and we'll engage with you in that way. Otherwise, we'll keep everyone muted throughout. For those of you using an ASL interpreter, you can just right-click on that box and you can pin that video, and that way that video is front and center for you. All right, so let's get started. I'll tell you a little bit about All Children Reading and the work that we do. We're a partnership of USAID, the World Vision, and the Australian government, and we've been working together since 2011 to advance EdTech innovation and research to improve reading outcomes for marginalized children in low resource contexts. Since 2011, we've been working together to source new solutions, test new ideas, and as we continue to move forward over the next 3 years, we'll really be focusing on scaling what works. Over the past 4 years, ACR has had a strong focus on supporting and enhancing learning opportunities for children with disabilities. And as part of that work, we funded a number of projects that use technology to support literacy learning for children who are blind, low vision, deaf, and hard of hearing. Today, we'll be sharing a little bit more about our experience in working with our M&E partner, School to School International, in adapting the EGRA to include sign language. Joining us today is ACR partner Josa, the Disability Inclusive Education Portfolio Lead at USAID, and Kristina Solum, Senior Director of Literacy and Learning at School to School International. So now I'll just turn it over to Josh.
Hi. Can you switch the video to me? I'm not sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Josh Josa. I lead the Disability Inclusive Education Portfolio at USAID. I want to briefly talk about the intention of this webinar today. The purpose of this webinar is we want to share information with the community about what's happening related to All Children Reading, the grant in Morocco. We'll talk briefly about the project, but more in depth on the successes and lessons learned tied to early grade reading assessment adaptation process for sign language to adapt that into the EGRA. The EGRA itself is a tool that USAID it's a standard use in many different countries that measures the early literacy results, early grade reading results, to see if children are on par or if they are below or above, so that way it can inform the program process better. So before we get into what the project is about and the goals, I want to again touch on just the challenge with the deaf and hard of hearing community. Really, only 2% of 32 million deaf and hard of hearing children all over the world have access to education in sign language. That's impactful because education is a fundamental human right. And if we don't have access to quality and equitable education in a language that they are able to use and understand, how are they able to learn? So the deaf community is a disability community, but also it is a minority, a linguistic minority. So we need to have both of those considerations applied to this. The deaf community also is a horizontal identity. That means that their culture, language, and identity exchange is not from family members and generations passed down. Often it's through outside community members. What that means for the education means that many deaf and hard of hearing children who are born to parents that don't know exactly how to best meet their deaf child's needs, which means that we really need to include those deaf adults who have already went through the experience of the education system and know exactly what to do to become a successful deaf adult. In Morocco, the sign for Morocco is this. The deaf and hard of hearing community, oh, the next slide, please, sorry. Thank you. In Morocco, the deaf and hard of hearing population, about 155 to 400,000, that range is an estimate because the data collection system all over the world for disability really needs a lot of work. So that's an estimated number in Morocco. Educational opportunities for the deaf community in Morocco oftentimes max out at grade 6. What does that mean? Many students who want to become teachers or have goals of more professional jobs, it's very limited for them. Also, another big challenge is there's no formal teacher training programs for deaf education. Training programs for sign language, professional interpreting do not exist. So that means the deaf community and their opportunities are really limited. Around that time of the All Children Reading, we deployed a round 2 in 2014, a grant competition seeking where technology-based innovations can improve early grade reading outcomes in developing countries. We have 3 areas of focus, one being children with disability. IDRT, the Institute for Disability Research and Training, sent an application in, and their innovation was they wanted to build a software called MSL, Moroccan Sign Language, Clip and Create. That allows users to access a dictionary that has pictures, videos, and different types of resources to create MSL materials. Their project goal had 4 main priorities: wanting to develop a software to then give to parents and children so it's easy to use. They want to use that software to train different people, community members, parents, teachers, deaf community stakeholders, how they can use this software, as well as train teachers and other people within the school environment, train them on how exactly they can incorporate sign language into their instruction. That means they'll have language development and they'll have the technical skills to literacy education. And the 4th will go more in depth now, developing an assessment, early grade reading assessment, paired with sign language assessment, and how exactly we do that. I'm going to turn this over to Kristina, who really is a big piece of this journey, and I really appreciate that she's been a part of this project and experience. So Kristina.
Thank you. So my name is Kristina Solum, and I'm the Senior Director of Literacy and Learning at School to School International. Deborah, you can go to the next slide. And we had the opportunity to do the evaluation of this project that Josh was just talking about. And so we sort of dove in and just had to learn a lot as we went, because there was no real roadmap for how to develop an assessment for students who are deaf or hard of hearing, using an EGRA or using any sort of rubric that we could already find in the community. So I wanted to just share a little bit about some of the successes that we had, some of the challenges we had, and lots of the lessons learned that we had around what actually did work, and then areas that I think all of us could keep contributing to ensure that we have good assessments for students who are deaf or hard of hearing, because there's still a lot of work to be done. This is one project and one experience, and lots of mistakes and successes happening, but definitely not a done deal. So I think this is a way to share kind of our experiences and then be able to kind of
let you all know where we think maybe you could engage and pilot other kinds of assessments or other next steps for this. I think one of the main things that I also really want to highlight is this was a long process. We ended up getting, the project got an extension, and we ended up using our initial kind of trip as that was supposed to be a baseline as a pilot, because we just realized that there was so much more to learn. So this was over almost a 3-year process that I'm going to talk with you a little bit about our experiences there. So Josh kind of set up a little bit about the project, but I wanted to give you a little context about specifically what we did our assessment, what the assessment was on. Video? Okay. So first, the context. We wanted to do an assessment for this project, and they were working with grade 1 and 2 students in 8 schools in Morocco. These schools were located throughout Morocco in different regions, which meant there was lots of regional variation in the sign languages that they were using. So the sign for school, the sign for lots of familiar words looked different depending on which school you were at. And so that was one of the key things that you'll see we had to address later. Also, something to note is these were all schools run by deaf associations, so they were not embedded in the governmental system. So they also had different types of teachers, different teacher training backgrounds. Some focused on sign language almost exclusively as a first language, and then transitioned to teaching Modern Standard Arabic as the reading language. Others really focused on getting students to use oral language regardless of their abilities. But that was really the goal, was to have them speak. So there was really a range of focus around language production and what is the appropriate kind of first language that the students should have access to. And even though there were only 8 schools, there were really almost 8 different approaches that we found across those schools. So the students were having very different experiences with sign language, oral production, and then Modern Standard Arabic, which was the language of reading. And the project was really supposed to be around reading, and we quickly realized that because of this diversity of experiences, there was a lot of language acquisition that needed to happen around the sign language. So we wanted to ensure that our EGRA also included some sign language acquisition assessment to try and figure out where are these students just in terms of their sign language abilities, regardless of their reading, knowing that then that would translate into the reading because it is a bimodal assessment. To the next slide. So a couple kind of unique considerations for the students in this project. As I was just saying, it's bilingual bimodal. So if the students don't know how to sign, then we wouldn't know their reading abilities, because we did ask them to produce throughout the assessment what they were reading. So they were reading as well as producing. So we wanted to obviously assess then their actual language ability prior to just doing the reading assessment, because otherwise we'd be missing whether or not the issue is around their sign language abilities or is it their reading abilities. There was really little data when we first started this project on the sign language knowledge of the students or the teachers. Some teachers were people that had just kind of been recruited through these volunteer associations. There was only one school that actually used deaf teachers in the classroom. Some other schools used deaf assistants, but it was also varied in terms of their background and what kind of training they had provided to the teachers. None of them were credentialed, though, in kind of the formal system. And I mentioned this a little earlier, but just really diverse school environments. So the students also were accessing the curriculum very differently. So they weren't governmental schools. So each school kind of took the standard Moroccan curriculum, and then some took 2 years to cover a year, some took 3 years, some tried to do 1 year, but they really kind of adapted in whatever way made sense for them and what their teachers could do. But again, their teachers didn't access formal training on the curriculum, so it was really up to them to kind of take it as a guide, but not necessarily meet it at the same standards that maybe teachers in governmental schools were using. The regional variations in the sign language was really a big consideration for us, because we quickly realized, even within 2 schools that we did the first pilot in, that students were producing different signs for the same answer. And also the assessor was not always clear to the students depending on what he was using. So if he was from Rabat and he was signing to the students, they couldn't always understand exactly what his signs were, because it wasn't the signs that their teachers were using in Fez or McNass or these other schools. So we really quickly realized we'd have to figure out what those regional signs were, what was varied across the schools, so they would have an equal chance to understand the instructions and to provide correct answers. And then finally, just the students had never really been tested, so a lot of them just didn't know what to do. You know, we'd ask them to do a timed test, and they would just maybe sign what the person was signing to them, or they would just think it was a question and answer. Or, you know, they just weren't sure if they should be repeating or doing what was on the paper. So a lot of kind of just getting them used to the test prior to actually doing the test was important, because it was clear that the testing environment itself was a little confusing to the students. Thanks. So I just wanted to go through kind of some of our key lessons learned. I would be happy to talk about any of these more in depth with anybody that's contemplating doing an assessment for students who are deaf or hard of hearing. But these were some of our big lessons and things that we had to think about to do our assessment. The first one was around subtasks. So there's a set of kind of core subtasks in EGRA, and there was a long conversation in the beginning, how much finger spelling do we assess versus letters versus whole word signs, and there was a lot of debate about what the value of finger spelling should be in this. So we did not focus on finger spelling. It's not used widely in Morocco. It's not really relied upon in the same way. So outside of the letter name subtask, we didn't really go further. We didn't ask children to spell words. We just asked them to give the full sign. I know other people in other projects are doing more focus on finger spelling. We opted not to do that based on feedback from the environment, looking at what the teachers were using and thinking about what would be most useful to think about what children need in Morocco to become successful signers and readers. Finger spelling didn't play heavily in that mix based on our understanding. So we did the letter name subtext, and then we did syllable identification, which in Arabic means that they did one sign and then they usually added a diacritic to it. So it was more around, could they understand what the diacritics were when the syllables were created in Arabic? And you'll see, I'll show you the results a little later, that was definitely more difficult for them than even familiar word reading. So they're much more comfortable just looking at words and signing them than they are trying to dissect, you know, the diacritics and thinking about the syllables as unique components of a word. Other people are doing a lot more finger spelling. Maybe in your context that would be important. In the States, that's very important. ASL uses finger spelling a lot. So people from Gallaudet that we consulted with really had lots of, they encourage finger spelling in certain contexts. And then when we went to Morocco, we realized that wasn't the case here. So it really is context specific and language specific when you're making that decision about how far to go down that road. The next one is around timing. So we really wrestled with how long to give them. Standard EGRA gives every student 1 minute on the subtask. We tested 2 and 3 minutes. 3 minutes was just too long. 2 minutes really did give students the ability to produce the signs. Even as they moved a little bit slower, signing takes a bit more time than oral language production. So we wanted to be sure to give them enough time to be able to show what they could do, but not so much time that it just was really laborious for them. So after several pilots, we kind of landed on 2 minutes for the students on each of the timed subtasks that we used. The next piece is around the sign language assessment. As I said, you know, it became pretty clear quickly that these grade 1 and 2 students were really struggling even with just sign language acquisition. I'll show you the results again on a later slide, but out of 10 very basic items, students could only maybe give 8. And these are like car, school, you know, really signs that every child should know after the first week or 2 at school if they kind of are being signed to on a regular basis, and they just weren't. So we did some receptive subtasks, we did some expressive. We piloted 4 different kinds of sign language assessments in Morocco over 2 trips, and we landed on this pretty simple one. It was a video where they would see the sign and then they'd have to point to the picture that matched the sign that they saw in the video. We videoed it so it was standard, so we wouldn't have people using different signs throughout the subtask. And we piloted those to make sure that students understood what they were looking at, and that they were sort of signs used across the country or adapted for that region. The next one is assessors. So the next 2 really are around the assessors. So we only had 2 assessors because there are just the 8 schools. We had 1 assessor who was hard of hearing and 1 who was hearing. We didn't have any deaf assessors. In our experience in Morocco, we couldn't really find a many people who were deaf and were very fluent in modern standard Arabic. So it was really difficult for us to have people who could actually become the assessor. We had a couple teachers that were already working in the school that could have done that, but we didn't want to take them from their school. So there were a couple people in the context, but there weren't that many. So we worked with one person who was hard of hearing and had been an interpreter for students who were deaf at one of the schools, and then a hearing person who was a teacher at one of the schools. And what we did is we divided the subtasks because they sign differently. We didn't want them to, students have different experiences. So basically one assessor took half of the subtask and the other assessor took the other half. So every student had the same experience of that specific subtask. It just took a long time for training. So whoever wants to go out and train these assessors, even though it was only 2 people, we had to do a lot of practice of mirroring with each other to make sure that they were signing the same signs and asking questions in the same way to be able to ensure it was both relevant for the students, but also standard enough that we could understand that the results were kind of believable and reliable for the context. Let me go to the next one. So the next 3 lessons, regional variations, I can't talk about this enough. We realized on that first piloting trip that students were not understanding, both our assessors and our assessors were not understanding the signs that were provided and didn't score them as a correct answer because they didn't think it was the right sign. So following that first pilot, we actually went around, we took the EGRA, we looked at all the familiar words, we looked at the story, we looked at all the responses, and we literally created a corpus of words, and we went around to the different, well, the project, Corinne, who's on this call, and her colleagues in Morocco, went around and actually collected the signs of these different variations at the different schools that we were working at. So we then could see, are there 4 signs for school? Is there 1 sign? Are there 8 different signs? And be able to learn which items might be the most problematic because the students would present such different responses. And then we trained the assessors on all of these variations so they would accept them and also so they would know how to use them in that region. So if they were in the south in Agadir, maybe they'd use a different sign for school. And they're very adaptable. You know, when we trained our assessors, they're used to being sure that they're understood. So once they learned the new sign, they were happy to try and use that sign, but we did need to provide it to them. They did not know, and they would have just been using their old signs if they hadn't learned what to use in that region. So it took time to both collect those signs and then to train on them prior to doing the actual baseline. The next one is scoring. We really needed to use video. We did some live scoring of the non-time subtask, so a comprehension question, we could do live scoring on Tangerine, but any of the fluency measures, if the student was at all proficient and able to move rather quickly through their test, it was too difficult to look at the sign and be marking in Tangerine at the same time. So we videoed all the students, and then we only rewatched the videos of the students who were signing fast enough that needed to be rewatched. Some students only signed 10 or 11 words, so that person could have scored it during the actual assessment. So we trained the team to kind of realize when they needed to rescore or not based on how fluent the student was. Sadly, we didn't have to rescore a lot. There weren't a lot of students that signed that fast that they couldn't do it, other than letter names, which is really, the students were the most proficient in that and fluent in that, and were really signing quite a bit. So that one almost always needed to be rewatched. But once we got to words and stories, there just weren't that many students that were going through it in a way that the person couldn't be marking it at the same time. The last one is piloting. Piloting is critical. Do piloting in different types of schools to understand what kinds of language the students have access to. And also, you have to have deaf people a part of that feedback loop of what did you find then? So you went to the school and you're seeing that students aren't doing very well in the test, but why? And it was only when we had people who were deaf and were using different types of sign language in the country help us really understand what we saw, and then also helped us think about what should we do for the next round. And you'll see on one of the next slides, I mean, that's just really critical, is we didn't plan well enough to have deaf people included in the whole process, to be honest. The first workshop we went, we had a couple teachers who were hearing and worked with students who were deaf, but we didn't have any native signers in the room, other than one interpreter who wasn't, using sign wasn't engaged in the workshop as a participant, just as an interpreter. And so we did, Josh really helped get some deaf participants in the workshop following the first couple of days, and that really changed our understanding of what the stories should be, what students struggle with transitioning from sign language to reading in Morocco, what they might be used to. Lots of things were helped because they participated, and we continued to engage them more and more throughout the process, and that really helped us understand what to do with the decisions and kind of the critical issues that came up. So just to give a summary, these are the final EGRA subtasks that we used on the EGRSLA. I'm not a big fan of that acronym, but it is the EGRA Sign Language Assessment. So that's what we've been using. It's a bit awkward, but it does get the job done. So we had a language assessment. It was a receptive vocabulary test with the 10 items. We did letter name, syllable identification, then we did the familiar word reading subtask, a reading passage. Instead of listening comprehension, we did sign language passage, so the students saw a video of the same listening comprehension passage that had been used in Morocco on the EGRA. So it was then signed to students, and then they had the comprehension questions. And then, of course, we used a home language use survey to just understand, were they from families who had used sign language at home? Did they have deaf parents or deaf relatives? When did they come to school? Some of these kids didn't come to school till 10 or 11 years old and had no deaf adults around them, so their language development was very delayed, whereas other students came from deaf families. Sign language was, all around them. They came to school at maybe 6 or 7. So the access to language, even though they were all grade 1, was just very different. So we wanted to have a little bit of a picture of that, and I can't recommend that enough, because it really does tell you a lot about the students outside of just what the reading test tells you. In a minute, the next slide. There we go. So here's a picture of what we found from the EGRA. So you can see this letter name identification. Just a reminder, these are all 2-minute fluency scores. So this is how much the students read in 2 minutes, not 1. For those of you used to looking at EGRA reports with a 1-minute correct words or letters per minute. So letter name identification, obviously the most proficient, right? Almost 80 words at the beginning and up to 87.9 at the letters per minute, and up to 87.9 letters per minute at the end. The syllables, they were able to identify 17.3 on average, and then it went up to 19.3 by the end. So that's the darker green. You can see the familiar where they did better at, right? So that's what I was saying a little bit before. Not a lot better at baseline, but you can see that the gains at end line were definitely bigger. So hopefully that's part of the project, and also just more experience with sign language throughout the year. But still 25 words in 2 minutes of the familiar word reading list. Then the reading passage, quite low. And so they only read around 12 words in the beginning and around 13 words at the end of the project per minute. So when they got the same passage, and again, these are all the same subtasks that the students in Morocco were using on the other EGRA that were then adapted to be used in sign. So the hearing students who are reading this orally are not substantially better. So it's not that these students are vastly behind a high-performing grade 2 class in Morocco. But still, they aren't able to do very much on the reading passage. Reading comprehension, they weren't given very many questions because they didn't read very far, but they didn't get, many of them right. I think really one of the biggest kind of findings, interesting curiosities is this MSL comprehension. So this is where we took that listening comprehension story, we turned it into a video. We let the student watch the video. So it was the same story, really interesting story. It was signed really creatively and child friendly. We had a person practice it many times to make sure it was really accessible for students. Then we asked them 5 questions, and they got less than 1 right at baseline and at end line. So children who are deaf, typically storytelling shouldn't be that hard for them. So we don't know if that's because the form of the test, they weren't sure what to do with the video and it was confusing. We don't know if the students really are not getting stories told to them in Moroccan Sign Language. They're getting more informal use of sign language told to them. so it was kind of strange to have an MSL story told to them. We're just not really sure. So that's definitely one of our curiosities as to what we should do next around a language, like some sort of language comprehension test, because it didn't, I don't know if it performed well or not. And then the MSO vocabulary test was where they had 10 students, 10 items, and at baseline, they were able to identify 7.5 of those correctly, by endline 8. Again, these are very simple words. You know, we're talking train, school, chair, book, read, play, so simple nouns, simple verbs, things that you would think if you've been in school for a little bit of time, you would be able to do at least those 10, and they just really weren't able to. So that's a little bit of the findings. I'm not going to put up grade 1. These are just the grade 2 mean scores. And then you can see the percentage of 0 scores. So at baseline and endline, both, no students had a 0 score on letter name or syllable identification. And then as we go to the more complex tests, lots more 0 scores happen. The MSL vocabulary, no 0 scores, but also, you know, students are not hitting it out of the park as you would hope if they've been in school. Next one. So a couple of just successes that I want to be sure to highlight. It was the first time in Morocco that there was a snapshot of students learning in both Moroccan Sign Language and MSA, Modern Standard Arabic. So there just wasn't a picture before of how well the students were doing. After the pilot, we shared this with some of the principals of these NGO schools, and there was a lot of kind of aha moments. They didn't always agree with the results, but they at least acknowledged that it was giving us more of a picture than they've ever had. So they sometimes thought we didn't get the regional variations right. They sometimes thought other things were not perfectly done, but they also said, you're right, our students are not reading at grade level, and this is the first time we've actually done an assessment of them. It also really raised, I think, at the ministry level, Josh can talk about this a little bit more, he was in a lot of these conversations, but just really raised an awareness of the need to build that sign language base with these students. If they are able to go to a school, but then they're not having access to regular sign language because the teachers don't know sign language and there isn't a sign language rich environment, then they're not going to become proficient readers because they don't have a language base to build that on. So just really kind of emphasizing that. I think people kind of knew that, but Josh ended up in lots of conversations, I think, with people at the ministry around just the real importance of sign language first and kind of reading as a secondary acquisition, but not focusing so much on just reading and kind of assuming that there's a sign language base to build that on. And then finally, I just think there was a success around decision makers finally had a way to understand something around these NGO schools and whether or not they should be adopted into the governmental school system, whether they shouldn't be in the governmental school system, but like now they just had a better picture. And I think it prompted some decisions that are still ongoing with the government in Morocco and USAID around what could be done to address the needs of these students. So just one last slide for me. These are some of the things that I think need to happen the next time people are doing assessments for students who are deaf or hard of hearing. I think we really need to figure out what a good sign language assessment is, so a battery of tests, whether it's a receptive and an expressive, how long should it be, you know, what is the right way to do it? Is it right to have the video and 4 pictures, or, you know, are there other receptive ones that should be better? Again, we tested 4. This one kind of performed the best and was most reliable, but it's not perfect. You know, so I'd love to kind of figure out what would be. It would be. Sorry, I think there's an echo. Just a second. So it'd be great to figure out what a good set of sign language assessments should be, and so I'd love for people to be testing different ones, and if we could come together later to kind of think about which ones held up the best. I know there's an oral language module that USAID is working on. Maybe some of those learnings can be adapted for sign language, but definitely this is an area of real need, I think, for this community. I think we definitely want to better understand it in different country contexts and different sign languages and different reading languages. What are those thresholds? How much of Moroccan Sign Language should kids know before they can really become proficient readers? What's that base of language that's needed? And, you know, we know that that's different in different contexts. So just thinking about those threshold levels, I think would be really helpful. The story comprehension subtask, it didn't perform very well. We know these students know a bit more than that really seemed to show. And I'm just not sure what happened. And we kind of got feedback from the assessors and nobody was quite sure why it was so hard for the students. So thinking about what kind of adapting that listening comprehension subtask to a sign language comprehension subtask and how best that could be done and make sure that we're getting the student storytelling, comprehension abilities. I really think we need to be assessing teachers. The teachers had so many different varying levels of sign language. It would be helpful to know what sign language they know and, sorry, I can't see the screen. What sign language they know and what types of sign languages they're using in schools. Are they using more vernacular sign language? Are they using a standard sign language that the school is requiring them to use? Some kind of variation of those two. So what are the students having access to? Because if you know what the teachers are presenting, then you can better understand what the student's acquisition might be. And then I can't underscore this enough, just the deaf community, deaf experts really need to be a part of this whole process. An adaptation workshop should not happen without the deaf community. You should have deaf assessors there, or at least observing the EGRA so they can give their feedback about the students. They also were the people that made the students feel comfortable. We always had somebody kind of go in and explain what was happening. And once they saw that the person was deaf, they would be much more comfortable and willing to do it. When it was only a hearing person signing, it was okay, but definitely not as good. So I think it's just a really, really important thing to have deaf people kind of in every part of the process as reading experts, language experts, assessors, teachers, telling you what the results mean. So just really, they have to be a part of this if it's going to be meaningful. Josh, over to you.
Thank you, Kristina. We want to make sure we can see, you can see me on the video, correct?
I can see you fine. I assume the participants can see you as well.
Okay, great. I can't see myself, so I just want to make sure. Great.
For those,
thank you for the summary.
So I was just going to say, for those on the video, if you're unable to see Josh, you just need to scroll through the videos and then you can just right-click and pin that one.
Someone said they could, Anne said they could see me, so.
Okay, great.
Great. If you cannot see me, please type something and I'll make sure that my video is showing. This is Josh talking. Anyway, so I'll move forward. Kristina, thank you for your summary about the project. Really, I want to remind everybody here that this work and this effort really is the first of its kind that we know of. The first known EGRA adaptation that includes sign language. Would you mind moving to that? Oh, perfect. So it's the first of its kind. And really, just like you said, Kristina, we've faced many challenges within the country just because everything was so new to so many of the stakeholders involved. But I want to talk about a few things on how the work was, but also what type of implications we have for the future efforts that include deaf and hard of hearing community and the disability community in general. But for the deaf and hard of hearing community, it is really essential, and we need key stakeholders that will contribute to the success of this project. We need to include the deaf and hard of hearing professionals and experts. In the case of Morocco, there were not many experts or professionals, but it shouldn't matter. They have lived experience and they can contribute to the success of this project if they are included in the design and implementation and can contribute to the sustainability of this as well. Another part that is important to incorporate are parents and community members. Prior to the beginning, when we were talking about many deaf children having horizontal identities, that means many parents and community members don't know what to do with these deaf children. So we need to bring in the community members and parents to tell them what's important for deaf children. That's key, because we know that parents' involvement in children's education really is essential to making the children thrive in the educational environment. Also, it's important to be mindful of exactly what type of attitudes that are in country and in the context that includes parents, schools, and just the community at large. Any type of work that we do with marginalized communities will have some type of negative attitude or perception against them. So this project automatically should have borderline, just raising awareness and changing the attitudes, because if we don't, then it's the great work that's happening, but when we bring it to the government or any other levels, try to make things sustainable, it could fall apart, because people will look at that and say, sign language? What are you talking about? Sign language is not a real language, and it'll already collapse before it began. So keep that in mind. Also, be aware of what type of power dynamics are there. There's a strong relationship with attitudes and power dynamics. Attitudes of looking down on these people, but attitudes often are people who have power, have that ignorance, and they have that ignorant attitude. So we don't know if you don't know what type of dynamics are in the deaf education context or system, maybe there are people there that are like, oh, I want to do good, and they believe that they are doing good work, but maybe it's not the best approach, or how can we adapt that and be mindful of things that are happening like that. Also, and the last thing that I'll say, well, there's so many more things that you could read in the report, but for the purpose of this webinar, I'll keep it short. So the third is assistive technology has the ability to support learning outcomes. It has a huge potential. However, it really should not replace the foundational skills, the building blocks of those foundational skills, especially the building of language skills that will then lead to pre-literacy skills that then lead to literacy skills. All of that combined, the technologies that we saw in Morocco, if the children were young and we gave them the technology, the children will look at it and say, what do we do? Maybe they could learn how to use it, but oftentimes it's not the best at acquiring language and literacy through technology at that very young age. But if we give it to a teacher or a parent, but they're not proficient in sign language, or they don't want to learn sign language, the technology might not work. So we still need those building blocks and those skills. Also, I want to go back to what Kristina was talking about. USAID, their continuing work, or this effort in Morocco, really informed a lot of and changed some of how USAID thinks about testing for early grade reading. So expanding on their perception of what it means for expressive and receptive modules. So right now and going forward, we're still working on expressive language module, and hopefully that will be finalized soon. Anyone who would want to be involved in this process, as well as the EGRA-SLA, or the development of that process, the goal is wanting to send out a survey to get more information about what's happening out there. What can we band together and talk about to make this exam stronger? And if you want, please go ahead and send me an email to me after this webinar or after this presentation. Email JJOSA, and I'll type it in the chat box as well. If you want to be included in that survey, please email me after this webinar. I want to share a few big successes from this project overall as well. Just like Kristina mentioned, the Ministry of Education in Morocco really recognized and became informed because of this one small project. Corinne, from the IDRT team, as well as the Morocco USAID mission, really did such a great job of engaging and talking and discussing with the key stakeholders in country. And one example of that is the deaf education system, including teachers and schools. Now we have a coalition to discuss how we can support one another for the future and trying to improve for children. Also, I'm excited to announce and inform you that earlier today, I think, in Morocco at 10 in the morning, so they're 5 hours ahead of us, we had a MOU, which is a Memorandum of Understanding, signing ceremony by the Ministry of Education with USAID and one deaf schools funded by the Princess of Morocco and Mohammed V University. there are 4 different groups that signed and agreed that they'd like to establish a system, some type of system to cultivate teacher training for deaf education in Morocco. Because of this work that was done, that really pushed the government to recognize that it is essential to do inclusive education for all children with disabilities. So this is a really exciting time to see what exactly is coming up from this. So next slide. So we'll go ahead and open this up for any questions that you may have. I recognize some people have already typed, I noticed some people have already typed some questions. So again, anyone interested in being a participant in the survey by being part of that discussion for the EGRA-SLA? Any questions? And I'll be typing my email in the chat box.
I just want to flag, there's been a lot of questions just about numbers and specifics around the project. And those Shelley has linked, and you'll see in the chat, to the actual report about the project and the EGRA adaptation. So you can find that there. We're just kind of quickly looking through some of the chats to see the questions that have come up. And I can't thank Josh and Kristina enough for their great presentation and explanation around this project and the work that was done, and also Corinne, who's on the call, who was the lead of the project itself.
Deborah, I think there's a couple of questions for Kristina around the assessment, and then one big one probably for Josh. So maybe for Kristina, there are 2 questions. Uh-oh, sorry, I'm echoing. There are 2 questions around the assessment. Okay, sorry, too much echo.
Try again, Shelley.
Okay. About the transliteration of modern standard Arabic into Moroccan Sign Language. Do the signs mirror the spoken language one-to-one, or are the signs concepts, icons, etc.? They were wondering just about the process for designing that subtask and what that looked like. And then another question about benchmarks for a 2nd grader must be able to read X number of words or signs in 2 minutes. So maybe Kristina, if you can speak to those, and then we can move on to the ones for Josh.
I'll talk about the benchmark for a minute, but I'm going to actually have Josh talk a little bit about the relationship between MSL and MSA. I think that'd be more appropriate. So in terms of the benchmarks, there are no benchmarks for these students. They don't exist in like the public school system, so they're not counted in the EMIS data. There aren't specific benchmarks for these students. In terms of the grade 2 benchmarks for students who are hearing and using oral language, I don't recall those at the moment. I can certainly look them up in one of the EGRA reports from Morocco, but I think it's probably close to 30, 40 words a minute, but that's just a guess. So certainly they're well behind that, but there aren't specific benchmarks that these schools are being held to.
To answer your question, Modern Standard Arabic as well as Moroccan Sign Language, they are completely different and separate languages. One example that I'd like to share with you guys that happened during the teacher training program in Morocco, we asked one deaf Moroccan to please come in and sign one phrase and ask the deaf teachers to go ahead and write down in Arabic what exactly that phrase was. The interpreter is going to not voice. I've asked the interpreter not to voice. I'm going to sign first. And I want you guys just to think about how you can translate that, and then the interpreter will voice. So now the interpreter is going to voice that, okay? Driving in our car, oh my gosh, it was swerving. We slatted until we finally got to the end, or got to the curb. So that's just one brief example of, technically I signed maybe 2 or 3 signs, but how many words did it take for the interpreter to interpret that? It's the same thing with any other spoken language. I keep forgetting that the word, but I know that there's a word in Tibet. There's one word that means everlasting love of the world and light on you, but it's just one word. We have to expand on that to many different words to just describe that one word. That same idea applies here.
There's a question, which I think is really interesting, about how much children get read to in school and the relation to that with the comprehension task. For example, hearing children, a lot of times teachers will read storybooks to them, ask them questions about the story. Were you seeing this in Morocco? Was this something that was common? What are the gaps around signing stories to children and letting them engage with whole language in that way?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely asked teachers a little bit about their practice, and people said that they did tell students stories. They didn't necessarily read stories out loud to them, but they would tell stories at the beginning of the day about what happened on the way to school or what, happened last night. So kind of natural storytelling that happens at the beginning of a classroom. And yet students, when asked comprehension questions, I think the reality is, well, a couple of things is our sort of hypothesis. So again, we don't quite know. But teachers don't ask questions about that. They just might tell a couple things, but they don't really tell like a real long story and then ask questions about it. So students are getting like a couple sentences, but most of the instruction, most of the signing to students is direct instruction and then words. So there's not a lot of like whole sentence, whole story signing that we saw in the classrooms. And that, teachers or students talk to us about. I don't know if, that was Corinne's experience, but I definitely think, Corinne is saying we had to work on storytelling and eliciting language through questions during teacher training, because it's just not something that teachers were doing. So we definitely think that was part of it. Having a video and then having the students see the question was also, I think, maybe a little confusing. When we did it live, the assessors just changed the story too much every time. They're so natural that they would just sort of like say a little bit more about this thing or say a little bit more about that thing, because they saw that the students didn't know it, which is helpful from a like comprehension perspective, but not standard perspective. So we just struggled with how to do it. So maybe it was the video aspect that was also challenging, but definitely the students are not getting a lot of like, especially students who don't come from deaf families, they're not getting a lot of storytelling or longer conversations with adults in sign language, even in grade 2.
I just want to add to that, Corinne, thank you so much for reminding us that storytelling and getting language through questions happens during teacher training in Morocco. You're right. But part of that and what happened was the deaf teachers who made the videos then passed the videos to work together with the hearing teachers. They tried to develop lesson plans based on that. And honestly, many of the hearing teachers looked at it and had no idea what to do. Like, it was hard to follow the video for them. So I think that says a lot about the teachers and their overall capacity to communicate within MSL. So I think whoever asked that question is right on the nose. That is an essential question. If teachers are proficient in sign language and are able to communicate, ask questions, and engage with the students, that would reflect in the students' abilities. However, we do need to remember that many students are arriving to school. How old are they? We don't know. Some of them were arriving at age 10, age 6, and after how many years were they at home without any language? So that's also something to consider and remember as well.
There's also a more technical question posed to you, Kristina, around the need for the video, for children to watch. And they said children signing because of Tangerine. I assume this was an issue of the speed of the child signing. Can you discuss who scored the videos? Was it the same assessors?
Yeah, so we did, it would have been the same whether they have to mark on paper and Tangerine. It was just the reality of like looking at somebody signing and scoring at the same time. And that was the challenge. So any students who are very proficient and had to move and were moving quickly through the test, we rewatched the story after the assessments that day, and it was the same assessors, but they would come together. So there was a team of 3. There was a supervisor and both assessors. So any very quick student, all 3 of them would watch it and score it together, and then we would overwrite that old test. So the rescored would become like the new subtask that we would use for analysis. And so they would have to agree on which items they got right, and then score it following the assessment using the video.
One more specific question, and then I have one general question about policy overall. The more specific question is about, curious how the results were considered against when a student experienced hearing loss. So I'm guessing that's maybe comparing a student who had verbal language early on and then became deaf later. I'm not quite sure what the question is there specifically.
We didn't do any specific comparisons of different types of abilities or hearing loss or experiences of that. So I don't know. It was a small population. It was 8 schools. I think that's definitely an interesting thing that we could look at later, you know, with a bigger population and more experiences, but that wasn't something we did on this one.
And then I just want to add also to that, Kristina's right. In Morocco, we didn't really take a look at that information. However, what we do know from this, for example, could you pin me? Oh, thank you. Again, I'm just going to repeat what I said. Exactly right. In Morocco, we did not look at the difference between those who were born deaf or hard of hearing or those who were hearing and later became deaf or lost their hearing. So those differences we did not look at. But what we did look at, based in the United States and other Western countries in Europe, we do see that people who are born hearing and then become deaf later in life, they do have the foundation for language. They have that already. So their transition to learning sign language or just acquiring other languages, they do already have that foundation under their belt. But those who are born deaf or hard of hearing, their challenges tend to be that the families don't use a language that the children are able to use and understand. So therefore, their language delayed.
Can you talk about
Okay. Joseph, you asked, you wanted me to talk more about the issues of non-standard use of sign language and what could be done about that, as it is important to supporting the larger scale efforts and improving literacy for children who are deaf. So that is a little bit of a tricky situation. Where do I start with that? Okay, so there are issues about standardizing language, period, because I mean, if I could be blunt, who are we to decide for the people and say, hey, yes, you are going to use the sign language that's used in Rabat, and that's it? There's issues with that the history of the United States is that they never had that standardization effort. It happened on its own organically. And how Gallaudet University was founded, it's a deaf university here in Washington, D.C. Many people in the U.S. go to Gallaudet to study and become teachers and then go back to their local communities. And of course, then they take what they've learned at Gallaudet, the signs that are used there regionally, and then also make new signs as well. And so that's how it kind of spread. Of course, here, even in the United States, we have regional variations. And we get along just fine. So I just want to caution that is a touchy subject, but what's important is to look at what needs to be done in teacher training, material development. All of that then links to working with the context and the people that are in country that make those things happen.
So I'm just going to pose one more question and then we'll close out because we're at time. But I think this is a really interesting question that was asked earlier on around Morocco having policies in place on inclusive education, yet there seems to be a lot of work that needs to be done. What advice would you have for those on the phone in regards to how they can engage with government to make sure that governments are pushing forward inclusive education, especially for children who are deaf and hard of hearing?
Just a small question to close us out.
Kristina,
that's your whole job, Josh.
Wow, that's the million-dollar question, I guess. There's so many ways that you can engage with the government. In my experience, and what I found to be most successful is getting the deaf community involved, having that discussion with the government, because those opportunities are often missed. And that applies overall to any disabled community. You have to remember that the disabled community is not the same. We have deaf, we have blind, intellectual disabilities, many different types. And all of their needs are their own. So setting up those conversations and opportunities to engage with the government is a great first step. Then the government need to recognize that inclusive education really, if we work on that inclusive education, it will improve education for all children, not just specific disability types. For deaf children or intellectually disabled children. The government of Morocco, my advice would be, and they are doing this right now, are building their system capacity to address different types of needs within the educational system for different children with disabilities, while also improving the general education classroom, making sure that they are inclusive for people with disability or without disability, and when they access school, they can get quality and equitable education.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Kristina, for the great discussion today. Thank you to all of our participants as well. We appreciate the work that you're doing, and thank you for joining this webinar. Such a rich discussion and so much to share and continue having conversations about. I just wanted to let you all know we'll be sharing the presentation with closed captioning in the coming days so that you have that to reference. Also, please feel free to sign up for our newsletter at allchildrenreading.org so you can keep in the loop with other upcoming projects and research that we're doing. As well, as Josh mentioned, he'll be sending out a survey in the coming weeks as well to engage with some of you around this topic further, and there'll be other opportunities to continue digging into this tool and figuring out how we can adapt it and make it more successful.
I think that's it for today, but thank you everyone for joining. We really appreciate your participation.
I'm going to close out the webinar, but I'll leave the chat open for the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes. If people want to send through their email or send through any questions, we'll leave that open for you. Should you have any final comments, we want to make sure we have an opportunity to connect with you beyond this. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.